Bonjour, good afternoon, and welcome to WASA Distance Education. My name is Greg Weaver, and this is ENG3C, Grade 11 College Prep English. I'd like to welcome everyone listening across the North today, at either home, your learning center, or on Bell Expressview. To call in and join our class, you can call 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. or 2983 in the Sioux Lookout, Lac Seul, or Dryden area. I'd like to welcome everyone back to class. This is our first class after the March break. Hope everyone had a good and restful, relaxing March break. I know I did. And we are back. We have 3 weeks left in this term. So we have a total of 11 classes. We have 4 classes this week. We have 4 classes next week. Remember, next Friday and the following Monday is Easter. So WASA will be closed on Friday, April 3rd for Good Friday. And we will be closed on Monday, April 6th for Easter Monday. So we only have 3 classes in that last week. Now we are currently just going to be starting lesson 13 today. So we're starting lesson 13, which is in kind of the middle of our novel study. I expect that we will have lesson 13 done by the end of tomorrow's class. We'll have lesson 14 done by the end of this week. And we'll get a start with lesson 15, and we'll wrap all that up probably by the end of next Monday's class, if not next Tuesday's. And that will leave us Wednesday, Thursday, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the next week to finish off Unit 4. Unit 4 looks at poetry and looks at writing your own poetry. Now, it's not going to take us very long to do Unit 4, and a lot of the assignments are pretty broad, are very open. So any challenges that you may have, you can pretty much do almost anything you want with it to make it, and it'll most likely fall within the guidelines of what the assignments are. So that's most of my announcements. We're picking up today looking at lesson 13. We finished off looking at lesson 12 before March break, and we were looking at some of the minor characters, looking at how you describe them, what do you know about them, and doing this kind of analysis of them. What we're looking at now in lesson 13, we're starting off on page 20, is looking at the figurative language. Or how does the novel use fancy language to help to describe and explain what is going on in the novel itself? So it says characterization is an important element of a novel because from the character's personality often arises the conflict which drives the entire plot. We talked about conflict earlier, and we went over a lot of the different details that occur with it. Well, often the setting of a novel can also provide additional information about the characters, or at least the understanding of the setting's layout, which you can then focus in on. And so, in this lesson, you're going to read the remainder of the novel. So we read as far as chapter 21. You had to read as far as chapter 21. We didn't read it together. We read to the end of chapter 21, which is around page 240. You're going to read the rest of it. Having done that, you'll consider the author, Harper Lee's, use of figurative language to add depth to her descriptive passages. You'll then create a map that shows the town of Macomb and the specific locations within that town that affect the plot of the novel. And finally, you will consider the impact that the setting has on the plot of the novel. So the first thing you want to do is read chapter 22 to the end. Now, in completing the novel, at the end of the second section, which is chapter 21, we learn that Tom Robinson, the person that Atticus was defending who was on trial, has been found guilty. So, take a minute to think and predict what you think will happen to him. Do you think he will survive jail? Will he be let go on appeal? What's going to happen to him? So, if you're still trying to get caught up in the reading, I had recommended that you use the March break to get caught up on some of the reading. Chapter 22 starts on page 284 to page 376. So it's always important to, when reading, to stop after major events and take a moment to think about what has happened and what the results of that event might be, just as you did with the verdict of the trial. It's time to finish reading the novel. As you complete it, take notice of the various locations that the action takes place in during the conclusion. Continue to look up any unknown or confusing words in the dictionary if they impact your comprehension of the plot or the characterization. So read chapter 22 to the end of the novel before continuing the next section of this lesson. Now, we are not going to be reading that together. There's just too much to go through. You don't have the time for it. But I do want you just to take the time, read through it, and just try to understand exactly what happens after he has been found guilty. So once you think you've got all that done, we're going to look at the setting of the novel. So the setting, both the time period and the physical location of the novel. While Harper Lee made up for a lot of details about the physical appearance of the characters in the novel, she's very specific about how the town of Maycomb has been laid out. In fact, some of the best descriptive passages in the novel are establishing a mental picture for the reader. Consider the following passage. It's very long there. It says, Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks in the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after the 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frosting of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in all the stores around it, and took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but it seemed longer. There was no hurry. There was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. Nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time for vague optimism for some people. Macomb County had been recently told there was nothing to fear but fear itself. We lived on the main residence street in town. Atticus, Jem, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. When I was almost 6, and Jem was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within colonies of Calpurnia, Mrs. Henry Levitt Dubos's house 2 doors north of us, and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We were never tempted to break them. The Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him like the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole of the quarter, a safe distance from the Radley gate. Now that is from the opening pages of our novel, way back in chapter 1. So we keep going. We pick up at page 22. It says, this highly descriptive passage allows the reader to generate a strong overall impression of the atmosphere of Macomb before he or she is even 10 pages into the novel. It not only develops the general layout of Scout's world, but also gives the reader an idea of the time period in which the story is taking place. There is an allusion to a famous speech by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the second paragraph. Lee writes, Macomb County had recently been told they had nothing to fear but fear itself. This is a direct reference to his inaugural speech in 1933, when he said, so first of all, let me assert my firm belief. The only thing which we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So if he had just told Macomb County this, the story must be taking place in the mid-1930s, placing it directly in the middle of the Great Depression. And in fact, Roosevelt was referring to the Depression when he made this speech. He was essentially saying, if we can't shake our pessimistic economic outlook, it will be tough to turn things around. Roosevelt was calling for a little irrational exuberance instead of hoarding any money that could be found that paralyzed the economy since the stock market crash in 1929. So, just want to stop and think about that just for a second. That president, Franklin Roosevelt, was inaugurated, took office, would have been early January 1933. And so this story starts in the summer, at least the summer after that, which we can assume was probably the summer of 1933. Scout goes into grade 1. So this trial that we just finished reading about, Scout is already in between the 2nd and the 3rd grades. So it's looking at the summer of 1935. So that gives us, just with that, looking at that and analyzing those details, it tells us pretty much exactly when this story is set, the year. So either 1935 or we could even say 1936. If it was a bit more the year after that, it'd be 1936. It's set. So let's think what else is going. So 1935, 1936, North America was still in the Great Depression. A lot of farmers had lost everything. There was a lot of drought or not a lot of rainfall in Canada's prairies and in the U.S. farmland. So farmers had no food and they had no money. Because there's no food, it means the cost of food in the cities went really, really high. And most people were out of work, so they had no money to buy food. So people had a hard time even surviving at that time. So you may ask yourself, how could I have got all of this out of one sentence in a novel? Now, realistically, it is very difficult to catch every allusion in every novel. Harper Lee provides lots of other hints that the Depression is the setting for To Kill a Mockingbird. She mentions the dust that blows through Macomb, referring to the Dust Bowl that shifted tons and tons of farm soil out of the fields and into other parts of the country. Later on in the first section, she refers to Dale's father as riding the rails, another common experience for out-of-work urban man during the Depression. They would hop onto rail cars and they'd ride the rails because there was not a lot of access to vehicles and you couldn't afford the gas for them anyways, and there wasn't a whole lot of highways at that time either. Most transportation was freight or people was done through railroads. So riding the rails means you're grabbing a free ride on some kind of rail car to go somewhere else. So if you're reading, you come across a phrase that sounds very familiar to you. There's a good chance it's either a very famous quote from a particular book and therefore needs further study, or it is an allusion to another book or speech and you need to go and figure out where it came from. The easiest way to accomplish this is through the internet. Go to a search engine such as yahoo.ca or Google and type in the phrase that sounds familiar. If you're lucky, the first website you come up from your search will tell you exactly where your phrase comes from. So other forms of figurative language. An allusion, we just talked about it there, is a type of figurative language. Figurative language is defined as language using figures of speech, simile, hyperbole, looks like hyperbole, it's pronounced hyperbole, metaphor, and personification to form imagery. That is considered figurative language. It's used to increase shock, novelty, appearance, or illustrative consequences. Figurative language is often necessary to convey the exact meaning of a vivid and artistic manner, yet a concise and to the point manner for your reader. So allusions aren't just what's shown in a novel. The comment by a narrator that describes a character as a proper Judas is an allusion to the biblical character Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus Christ. The narrator is therefore characterizing the character as someone who betrays even his best friends. There are many other types of figurative language that are equally important in developing characterization and setting. These include all the examples of figures of speech contained in the definition that's above: simile, hyperbole, metaphor, and personification. We're going to go over and explain all of those, and we'll look at some examples of them as well. So the first one is a simile. Now the first two you've probably heard of. Oh, sorry, the first and third one you've probably heard of. The other two you may or may not have. First one is a simile. Now a simile is an indirect comparison between two unlike things. So two things that aren't similar, using the words like or as. For example, an author might write that Jason was as fast as a cheetah on the racetrack. This simile compares Jason's speed on the racetrack to the speed of a cheetah, which is the fastest mammal on Earth. Although Jason is nothing like a cheetah in many ways, particularly in the sense that he has 2 legs, which he runs, and a cheetah has 4. The comparisons provide a good mental picture for the reader that helps him understand just how good a runner Jason is. Other examples of similes include her smile was like the sun on a beautiful summer day, and that's comparing the brightness of a girl's smile to that of the sun on a summer day. And her eyes were as big as saucers as she watched the play. Comparing the size of the girl's eyes to a dish, and thereby providing a visual image of her wide open eyes. Now, please note that not all sentences that use the words like or as are similes. The word like can be used as a verb, meaning to have an affection for someone. The word as can be used as an adjective in many different phrases, including such as and just as. A simile must be comparing 2 objects. And that's one thing that a lot of students tend to struggle with, is they think anytime they see like or as, it means that it is a simile. And that's not correct. Now our next one looks and sounds different. It looks like it should be pronounced hyperbole. It's actually pronounced hyperbole. Now, in a hyperbole is an intended exaggeration that draws the reader's attention to an important concept or fact. Every time, or at least almost every time, you hear or read the phrase, There were about 1 million people at the party. You are hearing an hyperbole or an exaggeration. The speaker or writer is trying to impress upon the listener or reader that there were innumerable people present at the party without coming up with a specific number. In this particular example, the effectiveness of the hyperbole is that every listener or reader can picture in their own minds how many people exactly would make up the party. To some people, 40 people would be a very full house and inspire that kind of statement. To other people, no fewer than 500 people would warrant that comment. Now, I'm sure you can think of other examples. A lot of people say if it gets hot or cold, it's 1,000 degrees out there. Or it's so cold out there that blank. That is examples of hyperbole, something that is just too far-fetched, that it just doesn't make any logical sense. Our third one we're going to look at is the metaphor. Now, this is the other one I think most people have probably heard of. The metaphor is very similar to the simile. And they're very similar in that they both are comparing unlike things. The metaphor is a direct comparison between two unlike things. It does not use the words like or as. A metaphor is different from a simile in that essential way. Instead of us saying that one thing is similar to or like another object, you are saying that one thing is another. Therefore, you're making a direct comparison. The comparison would then read, Jason was a cheetah on a racetrack. Instead, he was like a cheetah on a racetrack. He was a cheetah. Likewise, a second example could be written to read, her smile was the sun on a beautiful summer day. Originally, her smile was like the sun on a beautiful summer day. And our last example, as a metaphor, read, her eyes were saucers as she watched the play. The original was, her eyes were as wide as saucers as she watched the play. Now, really, the only thing that makes metaphors more difficult than similes to find and to analyze is that there's no key word that you can look for in a body of text to find them. Don't forget, though, now all that glimmers is not gold. Or more specifically, all sentences that use words like or as are not similes. Next, we have what's known as personification. And this is another 4 and 5. We have personification and alliteration. So personification is a very specific type of metaphor. In personification, the inanimate object is given human characteristics or attributes. For example, the statement, "the sun smiled down on us," literally means that the sun was bright. The way that the author expressed this simple fact, however, adds interest and depth to the statement. The sun is inanimate. It doesn't have any feelings, and it doesn't have a face. It doesn't have any of that. So, because it doesn't have a face and it doesn't have feelings, it cannot literally smile at someone. However, writers often say the sun and the moon have faces because it allows them to add that critical interest to their descriptions. Other examples of personification include death walks among us. Death is a concept, not a person, so it literally can't walk around you. And the trees whispered in the forest. Well, trees are inanimate, and they can't actually talk. So that is just more examples of personification. So that is something to keep in mind. Our last one we're looking at is alliteration. Now, alliteration is the intentional repetition of the initial sounds or series of words. Alliteration is used by the author to draw the reader's attention to an important detail or event. It's particularly effective when a story is read aloud, since the reader will naturally stumble over the repeated sounds. So, for proof of this, think of the tongue twisters, such as Peter Pepper pecked a piece of pickled peppers, or seesaws by the seashore. It's the repeated P's or S's that make it so difficult and sometimes fun to say. In other words, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Those are examples of alliteration. And it doesn't happen a whole lot, but you can identify it normally pretty easily. And it's kind of identifies it. So Looking at that, we have our support question next, and that's at the top of page 25. And it says, now you've examined some examples of each of the type of language, similes, metaphors, hyperbole, personification, and alliteration. I would like you to go back to the text that we looked at that was on page 21. You go all the way back to page 21. And that is the example we just read earlier in the lesson. So you want to try and find two similes, one example of personification, one example of an hyperbole, and one example of alliteration. And once again, there are suggested answers at the very back of this unit that will give you some ideas. And so you can find page 21. So let's look. I'll give you a chance to read that over, and we're going to go look at some of the suggested answers later on. So take a bit while I keep talking. Take a bit and keep looking over that excerpt from page 21. And we're going to look for examples of similes and metaphors. So first one we're looking for is two similes. So there's lots of examples of these in there. The first one is when it looks at the descriptions of the men and the women of Maycomb, where it says, by nightfall, women were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. So it's comparing the cake that's formed when you combine human sweat with talcum powder to the icing that you find on the top of a cake. And another example is the rad they placed drew him as the moon draws water. So that's comparing the draw that the Radley House has on Dill to the inexhaustible draw of the ocean's waters to the shore. And that itself is caused by the tides and the moon and how it influences the earth. So there's two examples right there of the similes. So next one, you look at example of personification, or giving something inanimate human characteristics and human qualities. So the first we come across is the phrase, the tired old town. So a town can't be tired. It doesn't exist. Instead, the town is old. locate a strong image. So the town's run down, needs to be fixed up. Not a lot seems to happen. Not a lot seems to change in that. And next one is example of hyperbole or drastic exaggeration. So the grass grew in the sidewalks, the courthouse sagged in the square. So grass can't grow on concrete or cement. It can grow in between it though. The idea is that it's overrunning the cement. That's also right there an example of alliteration. The grass grew and the sidewalks and the courthouse sagged in the square. So grass grew and sidewalks sagged and square are all repeated sounds that exist. And another example of alliteration is in almost the exact same next sentence where it says, bony mules hitched to Hoover carts, flicked flies in sweltering shade of live oaks. You have hitched to Hoover carts, flick flies, and sweltering shade. As another example of alliteration or the repeated sounds. So those are support questions. Now what we get into next is key question number 15. And you can find that on page 26. And this is looking at language for 10 marks. It says, now that we've reviewed the definitions of a variety of different types of figurative language, it's time to go back to our primary text. It's your task to find examples of each type in the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. You can't use examples we just identified or just looked at. You have to find your own. So more specifically, you need to find 4 examples of a simile. Remember, simile is using like or as in the comparison. You have to find 3 examples of a metaphor. You have to find 2 examples of hyperbole at least. These are all the minimums you have to find. You want to find more, you all means you're welcome to. And then 1 example of personification. And if you need to review as what some of those terms are, you can find them at that link that's under that. Now, I'm quickly going to start the next task and leave it there, and we'll pick this up again tomorrow. So, next we look at the town of Macomb. Now we've examined some of the ways in which Harper Lee describes the setting and the characters. Let's try to look at exactly what the town of Macomb looks like. So remember that by understanding where a story takes place, you can better understand the motivation of each character and the actions they may make. So, I want you to look at this support question here. It says, go back over the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, this might seem like a very daunting task, but consider it an excellent reminder for you of the plot that's happened. So you know we're very prepared for the essay you'll begin writing in the next lesson. Make a note of any descriptive passages that shed light on the layout of the town of Macomb. When you've have a comprehensive collection of your descriptive passages, create a map of the town. Make sure you include the location of the houses of the Finches, Miss DuBose, Miss Melody, Miss Stephanie, the Radleys, Mr. Hereford, and Mr. Avery. Where the schoolhouse is, the jail, and the courthouse. So, I want you to finish key question 15 tonight if you can. Keep reading this if you haven't finished reading the novel. If you have a chance, get started with that support question. We will be looking at that support question tomorrow. But if you do have everything done, I want to give those people who are done a chance to get started with something else. So you can look at getting that, or starting on that map. We will continue working this tomorrow. And I expect that we will get the rest of this lesson done by the end of class tomorrow. We don't have that much more to look at. And then we're going to jump right into lesson 14, which is looking at beginning to write an essay based on this novel. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. If you do have any questions, be sure to let me know. I will be contacting students to see how they're doing. I haven't received hardly any work from students in the last week or so. So we're calling everyone tomorrow. Other than that, hope everyone has a good night, and I'll talk to everyone again tomorrow. Until then, miigwech and